And so Aotearoa New Zealand, the Pacific and the SDGs, New Zealand is a Pacific nation and interfaces with other Pacific nations in many ways that have a direct bearing on our collective SDG goals. This panel will explore some of these pathways and offer a critical reflection on where to from here. How do we work together for change? So, without dragging things out any further, I'm going to hand over to Professor Stephen Ratuva, Director of the Macmillan Brown Centre for Pacific Studies here at Te Whare Wānanga Waitaha, the University of Canterbury. Kia koe te wā, Stephen.
Oh, Blubaraka, Common. Thanks so much for the very good introduction. It's quite late now, still in the office. My day hasn't finished yet. I'm cold and hungry. I'm not sure who to blame for that. It's going to be a very, very dynamic discussion. I'm absolutely sure about that. We have some very interesting speakers, very experienced experts in their own areas. And in this cold evening out here in Canterbury, it's going to keep us warm intellectually, also physically, I'm sure. Now, so we have 3 speakers, including myself. I'm supposed to be facilitating it at the same time, provide an introduction. First of all, thanks so much, Corbin, for the introduction, and Erika and Matt for the invitation, and Aotearoa SDG Alliance for organizing this very, very important series of seminars or panels, which is on a very, very important aspect of contemporary development in the world, and of course Meg for the lovely poem. Now, the panelists for this particular session, which is on the Pacific and Aotearoa relationship, Associate Professor Joeli Veitayaki, Diana Hinch, and Raihānia Tipoki. I will introduce them later, just before they do their presentation, just to make sure that you still remember who they are and what they're all about while they're speaking. Because when you're listening at night, people's memory tends to be fading away pretty fast. Now, they will be speaking, or we will be speaking because of the time, well, we're trying to manage our time here to make sure that we finish on time. Common has, been able to save us a few minutes. We'll try our best to save as much time as possible for the final session for the evening. Now, the speakers will be speaking for about 6 to 8 minutes. We've asked them to limit themselves to that so that we can have more time for discussions later. I think it's important to raise some of the issues which they will be raising. They're experts in their own right, and I think it's important for the audience to participate as well. And we'll try and finish this session by 8:15. It's 7:32 now, and we're still on time. Now, for the first 5 minutes, I'll probably get the ball rolling by providing an overview. I have a lot of hats. I'll put on my critical development studies hat here and perhaps do kind of a critical overview of the SDG itself and its relationship with the global south, particularly in the Pacific, because of SDG, the journey of the SDG, which happened after the Millennium Development Goals, was not as straightforward as it seems, because like any document, when you implement it, when you situate it in the complex world of politics, of culture, of economics, and of course now of COVID and of climate change, the climate crisis, or climate emergency, as we call it here, things are not as rosy as it looks. The SDG was, first created as a way of creating a great future for the world. The 17 SDGs to create a more equitable, humane, and sustainable world. And the document itself details what the goal should be for the different countries and how they can achieve those. And over the years, the national plans for economic development, environmental policies, the well-being strategies, and so forth, even university and high school curriculum, a lot of these have been framed along the lines of SDG. So SDG is kind of seen as kind of almost has some biblical, divine aspect to it. And the idea was to kind of unify the world under one roof in terms of a common global template for development sustainability. And that has been part of the narratives around the SDG. So from the point of view of the global South, and particularly from the Pacific, there are a number of challenges they have been facing. I think it's important to understand some of these challenges because we don't live in an ideal world, in a perfect world, because there are all kinds of political, all kinds of environmental, there are all kinds of cultural, ideological factors at play, which either will help or has helped or has derailed some of the gains of the SDG in the last few years. So, so a number of critics have raised some of these issues, and I think it's important for us today to understand some of these challenges, because unless we understand what they are, then looking for solutions and looking for a way forward may not be very straightforward. One of the issues, one of the challenges has to do with the global inequality of power and wealth, something which SDG framers, and I know most of them, one or two of them have been colleagues of mine over the years, did not take into consideration, because while the focus has been on countries themselves, the dynamics of power within the world is something which the SDG has been trying to struggle with. And that's an issue with a lot of the countries in the global South, particularly in the Pacific. And also while climate change and environment is part of one of the 17 SDGs, the bigger issue of climate change itself is a crisis multiplier. Is something which also needs to be looked at. In 2018, the Pacific Island Forum countries, including New Zealand, they passed a declaration called the Bold Declaration in Nauru, where they identified the climate crisis as the biggest existential threat for the region. And so the climate crisis, the series of of Category 5 cyclones in the last few years in Vanuatu, in Fiji, and Tonga, and so forth, have kind of wiped out some of the gains of, in terms of development productivity of SDG. And so some of these countries have to restart again as a result of the climate crisis. And also one of the issues being raised by some of the scholars have to do with the way in which the SDG has been used has become almost part of the system of audit, focusing mostly on measurable and quantifiable indicators, and not so much on the kind of more human factors which are more qualitative, like cooperation between communities and states, issues of empathy, of resilience, of adaptation, community and indigenous knowledge systems, which are not easily quantifiable. So the focus on the easily identifiable and quantifiable and measurable indicators tends to focus only on the metrics, which are pretty narrow. And what they've done in the last few years is to create the SDG index, where they rank countries around the world in terms of how they have ticked their quantifiable boxes. New Zealand is ranked number 23 over there, and Finland is number 1, and so forth. And in the Pacific, the highest is Fiji with 62 and Vanuatu 119, and the rest are not even ranked because of the difficulties in getting the quantifiable indicators. So one of the challenges here, one of the worries is that the focus on this audit kind of system takes away the spirit and the soul of the SDG in terms of its human factor, in where it should be, rather than a means of ticking boxes only and being ranked higher than the other. And a lot of countries have have been known to, to creatively configure their figures to make sure that they rank high. So even university rankings now, they have a new SDG ranking system where they rank the activities of the universities in terms of SDGs. And again, this is linked to the Elsevier Scopus system. They make billions of dollars out of publication, academic publication every year. So it's very much linked to money, not so much linked to the spirit of the SDG in terms of improving the well-being of people in the world, but rather how you can tick boxes and they make their money, Elsevier and Scopus, and then and rank university in relation to that. Now, of course, now the challenge of COVID, even some of the scholars who put together SDG have now admitted that COVID has actually wiped away the gains, a lot of the gains of SDG in the last few years. Something like 1.7 trillion US dollars has been calculated to be lost as a result, by 2030, as a result of the COVID. And something like 6% of the world's population, about 470 million people, will still be living in extreme poverty by 2030, which is the target date. So, so it's pretty grim what COVID has done in terms of challenging the gains of the SDG. So in terms of the Pacific, what's happening in the Pacific as a result of COVID has wiped away a lot of the SDG gain in the last few years. The high debt. Every country now is now looking for aid to try for budgetary purposes. And the rising poverty and the job losses in Fiji now, of course, as you in the news about the raging COVID-19, this new variant, the Delta variant, is getting the country into deeper and deeper debt. So a lot of the gains have been lost over the years. So those are basically some of the challenges. But of course, let's finish with a positive note. What are some of the way forward in terms of how can we overcome some of these challenges in terms of resilience, in terms of adaptation, in terms of being optimistic? Now, one of the ways in which SDG, in fact, some scholars have actually said that SDG is now dead. But some are more optimistic, said, hang on, it can't be dead. Depends very much on how we breathe life into it. It's just a document. So there are different ways in which we can breathe life into it, particularly from the point of view of, let's say, the Pacific and other global South countries. One is that SDG can be part of a kind of social protection and recovery mechanism for the losses which COVID has created. So it's some argue that SDG is a kind of wish list, a shopping wish list. Some are quite brutal in the way they put it. But pragmatically, countries can start reconfiguring the SDG, ideals of the SDG to refocus and rearticulate the process of recovery from the COVID. COVID has devastated economies, especially in the developing world, in the global South countries. And also climate change or the climate crisis has done a lot of damage in terms of achieving the SDG goals. So SDG can be reconfigured as a kind of climate mitigation and adaptation mechanism in a very creative and innovative way. That can be done. You take it and reconfigure it in a way which suits these circumstances. Thirdly, now in times of crisis, like the crisis that the Pacific is facing now, the dual crisis on top of each other. You have the climate crisis, then you have the COVID, then you have the mega crisis. Health was always seen as just an issue of development. In fact, now we've seen with COVID that is actually, it's driving development. It's driving then a lot of the human security issues. So it's time to kind of rethink about health through the COVID crisis as a bigger issue. Rather than SDG only looks at it as a as one of the goals. And of course, on top of all those is optimism and faith in our humanity and capacity to transform. That's one thing which humans have. And I think something which, despite the challenges of the SDG, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's still that capacity to be able to look optimistically at the future. And how one of the things which COVID has done, it's not all negative. They have, in the Pacific, for instance, they have created conditions for people to become much more resilient by going back to the social solidarity economy, the traditional economy, the traditional ways of farming, traditional ways of exchange, because the market economy is very, very fragile. A little, a little passing, whatever it is, and the market begins to crumble in different ways. So how can they sustain that that newfound resilience as a way forward? And of course, SDG has a lot to offer in that. So so there are a lot of there are huge challenges for the Pacific Island states. Just the other night, just to finish off, on Tuesday night, I think, no, Wednesday night, in the evening, about 5 o'clock in the morning, I was on a Zoom with the United Nations Security Council team, and the presentation was to do with small island states and how can small island states in the Pacific have representation in the Security Council. There hasn't been any Pacific Island state represented in the Security Council, and one of the points I raised was to do with the political complexities in the world within the UN system, and certainly with the SDG, there are a lot of these complexities which small island states have to go through in order to achieve their aims. So achievement of those aims is not a straightforward ticking the box exercise. There are all kinds of forces at play which they have to engage with. Now, I have a great pleasure, after confusing you in that introduction, let's now go to the real stars of the night. Now, we had a bit of difficulty earlier on. We were a bit worried about the connection with our Pacific colleagues from Samoa and Vanuatu. We managed to connect with Samoa. So Associate Professor Joeli Veitayaki has been able to, or would you like to click on your video, Dr. Veitayaki, so that they want to see what Samoa looks like. Oh yeah, there you are. Yeah. I know you still don't have a government there, but maybe very soon. Now, let me introduce to you Associate Professor Joeli Veitayaki. He's one of the leading experts in the Pacific on coastal management and ocean sustainability. He's won some international awards for his projects on sustainability. And he's been head of the marine studies at the University of the South Pacific, and also director of the International Ocean Institute in the Pacific. So he's going to be talking about his area of expertise, which is really ocean sustainability in Oceania, in the Pacific, and local communities and states and regional organizations as well. Note that Aotearoa, New Zealand is also part of almost every regional organizations in the Pacific. So when we talk about the Pacific, we also talk about Aotearoa as well. Not only are we connected by the same ocean, the same forces of climate crisis, but also culturally as well, as Rai will be talking about later, the cultural connection ongoing for hundreds of thousands of years between Aotearoa and the Pacific cousins. So Associate Professor Joeli Veitayaki, your 6 to 8 minutes, please. I think I have taken away too many minutes. Yeah, sorry about that. So we'll try and keep to the time now.
Thank you very much, Professor Ratuva, and good night to all of you. It's about 9 o'clock here in Samoa, but it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to share with you on some of the exciting news. I'd like to share some of the positive side of all the initiatives being undertaken in the in Oceania region for the sustainable use of the ocean, which, as you know, we, the people of Oceania, are responsible arguably for the biggest part of the world's largest ocean. We unfortunately are dominated in numerical terms by our smaller states, the Pacific small island developing states. So only Australia and New Zealand are our bigger brothers. So together we are responsible for sustainably managing about 38 million square kilometers of EEZs, and out of that, exclusive economic zone, out of that about 30 million square kilometers are under the care of small island developing states. Marine resources, of course, is very quite broad. It includes fisheries, maritime transport and sailing, tourism, marine research, seabed mining, submarine cables, and pipelines. So basically, for the remainder of the time, I will try and offer some examples, as I said earlier, to try and share some of the interesting developments that have taken place within our oceanic region. On the role of local communities, as in New Zealand, a lot of local communities around the Pacific are taking up the responsibility to look after their resources better because they have customary relations. There is very close relationship between society and their resources, and we've now, under the current context, taken advantage of that connection to pay a little bit more attention to the management and the health of our environment and our resources, and in this case, the marine resources. So in the Pacific, we have locally managed marine areas in Melanesia. I think in Tonga they have special management areas, and in Samoa they have community-based MPAs, which illustrate the commitment. These communities, small and economically weak as they may be, are taking the painful decisions to spare some of what little that they have for future generations. And in that light, in some of the places, they have adopted integrated resource management approaches. So it's not just the management of fisheries, but more the whole environment. So they're looking at the care of the forests, of the rivers, and of the coastal areas, be a little bit more wider in the approach. And for a lot of those integrated resource management initiatives, the response has been quite interesting. And in a lot of those cases, there's actually been partnerships with partners either from civil society, non-government organizations, or just interested people. The result has been quite significant for the Pacific. One only has to look at the I think there is a conference organized by the regional organizations PrEP on local community initiatives for the management of coastal resources. Secondly, I'd like to touch on the role of the states, and our countries are well known internationally because they have been raising in a lot of stages their frustration with what they regard as the unresponsive international community, in their view, not doing what is expected of them. So in recent times, a lot of the Pacific Island states have taken on the challenge of being leaders at the global stage in terms of the management of their resources. And I would like to mention in particular Palau. It has spearheaded the initiative to ensure the protection of healthy coral reefs as the centerpiece for sustainable development that supports strong and robust economies. Working together with other countries of Micronesia, Palau has pledged to protect 30% of its coral reefs, 20% of its forest resources by last year, and also contribute to the global coral reef conservation targets. The Micronesian Challenge has done very well in terms of publicizing the need for resource management, not only at the regional level, but globally. And as a result, they've also attracted technological and financial support for their community-based initiatives. Palau has also gone a step further, and in 2020, January 2020, commissioned the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, which was hailed by the Ocean Conference as one of the world's most ambitious ocean conservation initiative. The Palauans have declared over 500,000 square kilometers of their EEZ, which makes up about 80% of their whole EEZ, as a sanctuary where fishing and mining are to be prohibited for the protection of their inshore fish stocks, as well as the tuna population. They are going to live with the remaining 20%, but are going to use the fishing that is done there to encourage the development of domestic fishing interests to provide for the local demand. Palau has also declared a shark sanctuary because they have reasoned that live sharks are worth a lot more to their marine-based tourism industry than the price that are being paid to the fishes for the fins. The Marine Conservation Initiative in Palau is targeting to support their development of their high-end tourism, which they hope will ease the pressure on the infrastructure. Interestingly, Palau's development, as Professor Ratuva has mentioned, was also stymied by COVID-19. So I think there's a lot of hope that when things go back to normal, Palau may then be better able to assess how it has done under the current refocused development path. And it's interesting, Palau, Australia and Fiji are also a party to a group of 14 heads of states and governments that have formed the high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy, often referred to as the ocean economy. These 14 countries, which consist of large and small nations at all stages of economic development, control about 40% of the world's coastlines, 30% of the EEZ, and 20% of the fisheries, and 20% of the shipping fleets. So the hope is that this panel can take leadership in the articulation of sustainable ocean economy. In December of last year, the Ocean Panel committed to 100% sustainable ocean management in national waters, and it commits to putting in place a sustainable ocean plan by 2025 and ensuring the protection of 30% of the world's ocean by 2030. The Ocean Panel has also has produced a document known as titled The Transformation for Sustainable Ocean Economy, a vision of protection, production, and prosperity. It offers 74 priority areas that can guide in the critical areas of ocean wealth, ocean health, ocean equity, ocean knowledge, and ocean finance. So in my view, I think perhaps the guide to sustainable ocean finance can be produced by this consortium, which is slightly different from the regional framework in that it involves countries from other areas outside of Oceania. And lastly, I'd just like to mention that regional organization is well known to our colleagues in New Zealand because of the membership of New Zealand in most of these regional bodies. They were set up to assist the member countries with their responsibilities in the areas where they share interests. Sustainable development, of course, has come into that, in addition to education and other kinds of training on pertinent issues that the member countries decide on. I just want to finish off by saying that the performance of one of these regional organizations, the Pacific Islands Forum Fisheries Agency, has been quite remarkable in terms of the management of our tuna resources for the benefit of all our members and, of course, of the tuna and the distant water fishery in general. The FFA's accomplishment through the subgroup, the parties to the Nauru Agreement, and of course the negotiations and the formulation of the region's fisheries management organization, the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, is there for all to see. And I think the point is that if we can get our act together and strengthen a lot of these regional initiatives and partnerships, I think we stand a better chance, because the successes of a lot of the initiatives that have been witnessed in the Pacific, in Oceania, which includes New Zealand, would be very useful as we try to recalibrate and reorganize the way we address the future that comes after COVID. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Joeli Veitayaki. Now we're having a bit of difficulty in trying to connect with Vanuatu. I think she's on the line now. We will try to go straight to her before she loses us, and we lose her as well. Diana, are you there? Hello, we can hear you a little bit. Yeah.
Are you able to hear me?
Oh yeah, sure. Please carry on, please. So you have 6 to 8 minutes.
Okay.
Oh, let me just quickly introduce Diana. Now we're able to connect with her. She's the Commonwealth Climate Finance Advisor for Vanuatu, and she provides strategic and technical guidance for climate finance to support government effort to access climate finance. She's an expert on community sustainability. She did a PhD on that. and she'll be looking at community sustainability and women empowerment. Over to you, Diana.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ratuva, and thank you to the organizers of this event for the opportunity to be part of this very important panel. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge, as is custom in the Pacific, I'd like to acknowledge our elders who are esteemed members of the participants, as well as you, Professor Ratuva, and Professor Veitayaki, who was previously at USP, and I was a student there with PACE-SD when he was there before he moved to Samoa. So I'd like to acknowledge that and the leadership that you both provide, not only in your respective professions, but also for this panel. I have had the opportunity to collaborate and work with different practitioners and policymakers and recipients of climate change support for community sustainability in different local communities across the Pacific. And as such, in this space, I would like to focus on gender integration in climate policy and practice as a pathway for sustainability in Pacific Small Island developing states, more commonly known to us as the PSIDS. So in the PSIDS, local communities and individuals are already adapting to the impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise and coastal erosion, by employing coastal protection interventions, including non-structural and structural adaptation approaches, which at times are not always gender sensitive. There have been a number of examples where a gender responsive approach kind of aids effective climate change adaptation and policy considerations of gender equality and women empowerment. And this can be strengthened to substantially build resilience to climate change. Now, the lack of articulation in relevant policies and in their implementation obstruct gender inclusion in climate change adaptation planning and practices. Now, this is very evident in research findings from Pacific islands such as Fiji and Vanuatu, where the inclusion of gender considerations strengthens national planning. Policymakers are now more increasingly recognizing the importance of gender participation in accessing or in assessing rather, climate vulnerability and developing effective policies to address adaptation. So I'd like to use Vanuatu as an example. Climate change and disaster risks greatly impact the lives, social and economic well-being of women. And women make huge contributions to community welfare through disaster preparedness, through disaster response, as well as disaster recovery. And all this, as we know, contribute to sustainable development and sustainability of local communities and contribute to economic empowerment. So the government in Vanuatu has acknowledged that it is vital that women have full opportunities to participate in policy development, decision-making, and implementation at all levels. And as such has included gender mainstreaming in its national climate change and disaster risk reduction policy. So if you are familiar with the climate change and disaster risk reduction space, you will be aware that Vanuatu is perhaps one of the only countries in the Pacific with an integrated policy that has a gender aspect in it. And when I say integrated, I mean integrated climate change and disaster risk reduction policy. So initiatives to ensure that gender considerations are mainstreamed into all climate change and disaster risk reduction efforts are now being implemented at the national level. At the PCIDS level, they're beginning to integrate gender into climate change initiatives as they see the importance of this type of inclusion. The differentiated climate change, sorry, excuse me, impact of climate change on women and men, with special attention paid to local communities as well as indigenous peoples, is a very important consideration for us in the PCIDS. Now, as Dr. Ratuva mentioned in the introduction, I have a bit of a climate finance background, so not to sound biased, but I'd like to speak a little bit about the climate finance aspect here. So the importance of accessing much needed climate finance to address the sustainability of climate change and disaster risk reduction initiatives is very, very, very important. And in terms of sustainability, the inclusion of gender roles in efforts to access this type of finance for, let's say, adaptation and mitigation efforts is vital. So donor and implementation partners are becoming increasingly conscious of the impact of including gender roles and how specific projects will benefit women and marginalized groups. So gender inclusion has become a vital component of efforts to access climate finance. Perhaps, I hope my 6 minutes is not yet up, but perhaps I'll just sum up here and say that while tackling climate change and disaster risk reduction, it is vital that gender inclusion is considered at the policy level as well as in practice. And tackling climate change and gender inclusion at the policy level provides some level of sustainability for these initiatives, and it increases resilience in local communities going forward. So the inclusion of gender and specific roles and implications in efforts to access climate finance runs, if I may say, in parallel with policy efforts, and in the long run, it will ensure inclusion of minority groups in sustainable development initiatives. I think I will stop there. Thank you, Tomas, from Port Vila. It's 6 or 7:11 here, 11 minutes past 7 here. So I hope I have shed some light on the topic that I was asked to speak on. Thank you, Tomas.
Thank you, Tomas.
Thank you so much, Diana, for a very interesting presentation. So we are right on time. So thanks so much for being very timely and a very interesting presentation indeed. So last but not least, I know we're running out of time quickly, is Raihānia Tipoki. Rai is an ecologist, he's a naturalist, he's a farmer and oceanic voyager. He was captain of the Maori Waka, which sail around the Pacific with other Pacific Waka a few years ago, and connecting the Pacific and Aotearoa and the rest of the world, and how this connected to ocean sustainability. And of course, the connection between the Pacific and the Maori world. So Raihānia, you have a, we'll try and push it by a few minutes, although it's 8:12 now. We're supposed to finish at 8:15, but we'll push a few minutes further, so to give you time to sail.
Tēnā koe, Professor Ratuva, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou ngā kai whakahaere, kia koe kōba nā hau I whakatū te arawhata ki te rangi, kia tau mai ngā manaakitanga ki rungi a tātou tēnā rā koe. I'll try and make this quick. I've been asked to talk about the connections between Aotearoa and the Pacific. There are so many things, you know. I went to university, Victoria University, and I did a degree in ecology and a double major, a BA in Māori studies and te reo Māori, and learned all about how we are connected to our Pacific brothers and sisters. But it wasn't really until I met our waka te mataua Māui in 2010 and started to voyage throughout the islands that I really realized how much of a connector the Pacific is, and how the term Māori is actually a fairly recent term. Before using that term, the term Māori was only used when strangers came to our land, Pākehā came to our land. Before that, we were known as Ngāti Kahungunu or Ngāti Hinekōrako, or whichever hapu you belong to, and those hapu were nations. So I work now, I haven't been on the ocean for a while, but I work now to strengthen our hapu nations, understanding that the New Zealand nation is actually a breach of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So when and I'm taking Corbyn's advice to be brave and courageous, and when I see that New Zealand is a Pacific nation, New Zealand is a Pacific nation and that it exists in the Pacific, but the Māori nation is a true Pacific nation, and that it has genealogical ties with the moana and all of the peoples and creatures of the moana. When I was flown up to Tonga in 2010, I sort of blew open my world, and I realized I was part of a Pacific family. And as I went around, I've sailed over 40,000 nautical miles around the Pacific, to over 50 different islands, and everywhere we go, we feel like we're coming home. And that was one of the dreams when I first realized I had the opportunity to sail to the islands. I believed I was going back to Hawaii, going back to our homeland. And certainly everywhere we go, it feels like you're being welcomed by your aunties and uncles. And so when we talk about development, I know I don't have much time, so I need to get these things in. When we talk about development, I feel like, sustainable development goals, I feel like as Indigenous peoples, we are at a different starting point, and our ability to sustain ourselves was removed from us a very long time ago. So we're in a different space, and I feel like when all those, definitely felt like going back in time, going to the Pacific Islands, and yet village life, the value system that we talk about a lot here is inherent, and it just is so clearly a part of everyday life. Throughout the islands, we've got so much to learn about how to be in sync with nature, and only taking as much as we need. I feel like that time for me, the 10 years I spent going in and around the Pacific, was so powerful, because we had learned about the difference between waka, for instance, and the tall ships. And everyone's still, I think, looks romantically at our voyaging past. But I just think it's what our ancestors did all the time. They were on their canoes, trading and venturing, and we had it makes sense that we had the fastest, most agile ships, canoes in the world. Even our ability to catch food. People are like, how did your ancestors survive so long in the ocean? Well, they were going fast enough. Some of those tall ships don't go fast enough to drag lures to catch the fish. Our ancestors knew how to preserve the food from the land to take on the ocean, but also they were going fast enough to catch fish all the time. So, and then catch the water from the rain that fell on the sea. They could be out there for weeks on end and be quite happy. It's certainly been an eye-opener for me and changed the way I see everything, basically. Like I sort of alluded to before, and my time's probably up. yeah, we've got another connector for us in the Pacific is our colonial past, how we've been affected by imperialism. And I think when I look, and I know I'm not alone, at climate change and the challenges ahead of us, they're simply an extension of imperialism and of colonialism. The extractive culture that's been planted in this whenua is a huge challenge for us to throw off that individualism and the capitalistic system that we live in. It doesn't surprise me, Professor Ratuva, that there are nations out there making money off the SDGs. Yeah, I'd like to be more positive about the situation, but when I listen to the UN talking about 200 to 1 million climate refugees by 2050, I know the social effects climate change is going to have is really huge and a massive. So I think for New Zealand, we have to realize that New Zealand is the nation, Aotearoa is the whenua. Aotearoa is the whenua, New Zealand is the state. Is the state. So yeah, huge challenges ahead, but I think this is obviously these are the kind of conversations and discussions we need to have. Yeah, so thanks very much for having me. Hopefully we've got time to have some discussion, but I'm not too sure about that. Tēnā koutou.
Well, thanks so much, Ray. Very interesting indeed, connecting the Pacific and the Maori culture. Now, well, just in time, we were told to extend to 8:20 instead of 8:15, the original time. So we just made it. So this is what we're going to do because we don't have much time, and also the next session consists of much younger generation people who are probably very eager to come, to jump onto the stage and share their ideas with us. What we're going to do is we won't take any questions now. We'll wait until after the next panel, and then we'll take questions for both, for the panel, the next panel, and also if there are any questions for this particular panel. Three very interesting presentations, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I'm sure you have a lot of issues that you want to raise. And so I'm going to stop there now. I'm consistently looking at the time. No, it's getting cold and I'm hungry now. I'm still in my office. And that is the biggest driver of trying to make sure that we, are be on time. So I'll pass you on now to Bronwyn, who's facilitating the next session. So Bronwyn, it's all yours.